So welcome to this Friday's episode, you might say, 26th of June 2026 of the Human Rights Universal Global Open Talks, which aims to occur the last Friday of every month, barring national holidays and other types of event. It's based in the Human Rights Centre in Central, the Law School in Central South University in Changsha, kindly hosted by the Law School. And my name is Zhou Finnerty from University College Cork. And today we're very excited to welcome Eric Roberts, and who's going to, I'm just going to look at the heading of his presentation to make sure I get it correct. Europe's Legacies of Universalism and Particularism, a Conceptual Genealogy. Eric is, as you may have seen from the presenter profile, he's based in lots of places, a Dutch sociologist, critical theorist. I think he's tuning in from Wiesbaden today in Germany, but he also has is connected, you might say, with connections in New York and elsewhere. So I am going to welcome all who've tuned in, and just this meeting has been recorded. The usual format is we have a presenter presenting for, I was about to say as long as they want, but that's not quite true. 15, 20 minutes, perhaps half an hour if you like, and then followed by discussions, and we finish strictly on the hour. So that's enough from me. So I'm going to hand over, and Eric, you can introduce yourself further as you wish for the audience. So I'm going to hand over to Eric Roberts. Eric.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, so I'm glad to be here. Glad to tune in to this mysterious, exciting human rights study group, which is more global than I had anticipated. I knew there was some internationals, but I didn't know it was crisscrossing the earth. I was trying to touch on a subject. Oh, before we start, I need to maybe say something about my biography because it's so confusing, right? So I'm Dutch. I'm from Amsterdam. I'm a Dutch guy, a sociologist, but I lead the China initiative of the Telos Paul Picconi Institute, which is an academic publishing house in New York. So I'm the director of that, and we platform interactions between Western and Chinese social and political thought. And then in Budapest, I'm a visiting fellow at a geopolitical think tank named the Danube Institute. And my background is in sociology and philosophy, and what one of the key themes I'm interested in is the dialectical relationship, the tension between particularism and universalism. I'm looking at competing world designs, you may say, competing senses of universalism and the different particularistic counters to these universalisms. So China's been a major interest of mine. I've been a postdoc at Peking University, like many here. Like many of the foreigners, I'm still struggling with my Chinese learning textbooks, so we're making a bit of an effort there, and to learn Mandarin Chinese. And what a key interest of mine in China is the sense of reaching the universal from the particular. So if you look at contemporary Chinese concepts such as Chinese modernization path, right? They're very interesting because it presupposes that there is a modernization that is plural, internally pluralized, and so you can have something that's 100% modern, not less modern, but entirely modern and Chinese at the same time. A particular approach. The same you see with human rights. You'll see that there are the universal common values At the same time, there is the Chinese style human rights theory. There is the Chinese path of human rights, which is particularizing, acknowledging that there are various legitimate paths to human rights, but human rights themselves have universal validity. So that's something I'm really interested in. And to make, I try to make a little contribution, hopefully, to the conversation that you're having here in the Human Rights Study Group by reflecting on the interaction between universalism and particularism in European social and political thought in Europe. Because the and let me focus on a concrete question. Let me deconstruct, analyze the notion of the European Commission that European values, as they call it, are universal values. Now, that's a phrase that you hear a lot in European circles, at European universities, in European newspapers, in publications, of course, by the European Commission. You'll hear the phrase European values. Now, what are European values? Because the fact that you call them European seems to imply they have some kind of specific cultural and historical background, some kind of particular historical rootedness. However, when you actually look at how the European Commission defines European values, surprise, surprise, they are rule of law, equality, freedom, liberal democracy, human rights. And each of these, in turn, is defined in a universalistic sense. So by the European Commission claiming that European values are universal values, they make a very contradictory, paradoxical move where they on one hand claims to represent something particular, namely the European. And on the other hand, they claim to have an maybe exclusive right to universal political goodness. So what is going on here? It's, of course, and I think Chinese scholars will immediately recognize this. This is a universalism that's rooted in the 18th century Enlightenment. And this Enlightenment universalism, in the beginning of the 19th century, in the 1830s and 1840s, and this is less well known in the scholarly community, this Enlightenment universalism in the early mid-19th century gave rise to the concept of the West. Now, what's the concept of the West? Now, Western civilization, you can say it goes back to the ancient Greeks, you can say it goes back to Jerusalem or Rome or the Holy Roman Empire. You can have different timelines and different interpretations of the nature of Western civilization, right? We can endlessly discuss this topic, but where does the concept come from, right? The concept of the West is much younger than Western civilization itself. So when was the first time when people used the West in a Western context as a civilizational and political self-identification? A lot of people will be surprised to find out that this only happened with Auguste Comte in the 1830s and 1840s. Auguste Comte systematized this notion, and he developed this notion as a polemical counter against the concept of Europe. Now it gets very confusing, right? So at the time, the dominant self-description was Christendom, and an alternative self-description was Europe or European civilization. But Auguste Comte didn't like the notion of Europe because it put Germany too central. It didn't put France central enough. It included the Russians, which according to Auguste Comte were not in the same civilization, but a different civilization. And then he made a counter concept, which was Europe. And here it gets interesting, because what is Europe for Auguste Comte? The West. He defined the counter concept as the West. What was the West for Auguste Comte? It was the future of humanity. The idea was that humanity would develop in stages, and there are key Western countries, primary among them France, that lead the way. They have a more advanced rationality, more advanced science. They have a background in Christian civilization, but they're overcoming Christian civilization to go towards a rational, scientific future. And all people on Earth would probably, or most of the major states on Earth would eventually, or even all of the future states on Earth would eventually become Western. So the West is the avant-garde. That's the original meaning of the West for Auguste Comte, the first to systematize this notion. Now, I think and there's a recent book published about this by Fado Zakis in 2025, simply titled The West. And in this book, it's a revolutionary study, and it lays out the centrality of Comte to the concept of the West. Now, I think this is a great benefit for understanding contemporary political thought, contemporary senses of universalism in the Western world, to know that the concept of the West itself has a strong universalistic approach, inclination, and it's avant-gardistic, and it sees the West as the leader, and everyone else will have to follow. So everyone will become Western. Eventually, the West will completely universalize and cover the globe. So there, the paradox, of course, is when the European Commission now uses that notion of Enlightenment/Western self-universalization to define European values. It does something very ironic, because the concept of Europe was originally a counter-concept. What was Europe? Europe was the competitor concept of the West. And until the beginning of the 20th century, mid-20th century, intellectuals in Europe were conscious that the concept of Europe could be used as a counter-concept to the West. So, for example, Thomas Mann, during the First World War, he wrote a book titled The Unpolitical Man, published at the very end of the First World War. It was a war polemic in which he argued that Germany represented the true European spirit against the West. And Germany was defined as outside of the West. The West was France, Britain, and the US for Thomas Mann in the beginning of the 20th century. So up until the middle of the 20th century, what you see is that Europe is seen by European intellectuals as a counter concept to the West. Now, what does that mean? That means that the notion of Europe, the self-identification of Europe, was more historicist, more particularizing, and more romantic. Now, Romanticism emerged against the French Revolution and against the universalism of Napoleon and the Jacobins. It argued that Europe consisted of nations with particular histories that needed to be respected. And the early Romantics reacted against the French exclusive claim to universalism and the Revolution's exclusive claim to universalism. And they countered it with a historicizing self-depiction, a historicizing sense of nation, and a historicizing sense of European civilization. So therefore, it's so ironic, right, that the European Commission now defines European values as the universal values, because they're basically taking the word Europe, but they inserted the semantic of the West. Now, so here what we see. So these debates about the meaning of Europe in the contemporary European context, centering on the question of what are European values, with the European Commission defining these values as universal values, and national conservatives and populists and nationalists, Christian Democrats of all stripes throughout the European continent propounding counter arguments, countering this claim to universalism with a historical particularism. All of that has its roots in a dialectic that emerged in European thought in the early 19th century, the dialectic between the Enlightenment and Romanticism, between the notion of a universalizing West and a particular, culturally and historically particular Europe. And nowadays in European politics, this dialectic, this tension, is still enormously relevant, because when there is a counter to the universalism of the European Commission, it's in the name of history, it's in the name of nation, it's in the name of the historically particular, it's in the name of the a European civilization with a particular historical and cultural content. So, for example, Italian government the Hungarian government, the French right, whenever they challenge an overly centralized European Union led by a centralistic European Commission that sees itself as representing universal values and having a leading role on the world stage in reshaping the 21st century, then they counter this. The counter throughout Europe is rooted in the original romantic counter to 18th century Enlightenment universalism. So you have this dialectic that started over 200 years ago, and that's still arguably the primary dialectic in European political thought. And I think it touches directly upon your work here in the human rights group, because, of course, Chinese thinkers have always been very much aware that there is this strong universalizing tendency in Western political thought, and also very much in the way Western political thought approaches human rights. There's this constant fallacy that Western thinkers will claim to have an exclusively legitimate approach to human rights, and will regard all other approaches as either backwards or manipulations. So the idea is that when China talks about human rights, it's not real, or it's only real if their normative perspective maps one-on-one to Western perspectives. Now, this is something that Chinese thinkers have always challenged. This is something that many intellectuals throughout the world have challenged. But importantly, it's also something that European thinkers themselves have challenged from the early 19th century onwards, when they challenged French universalism. So basically, what I would propose is to see that we are still in the same dialectic as 200 years ago, and that we're still fighting this war, particularism versus universalism. But the key important element here is, of course, that the particularists are not denying the existence of universal values. They're just saying, as is very much the case with contemporary Chinese political thought, they're just saying that there are various approaches to the universal, and these approaches are culturally and historically particular. So when China says it has its own approach to human rights, and hence has a particularizing approach, right? Because it self-recognizes that its own approach is rooted in culture and history and is specific and can be different from other legitimate approaches. By making that pluralizing and particularizing approach, it doesn't claim that there is no universal. Quite to the contrary, it says there are human rights, they have universal validity, they are of universal concern, but there are various legitimate approaches that exist side by side. And this is exactly something that Herder in the German context, or Carl von Sophony in the German context, or Burke in the British context would have argued. So all of these early Romantic theorists were exactly on this topic. And then throughout the late 19th century, early 20th century, it was very much Germany that was leading and what at the time could be understood as an anti-Western campaign. So there were a lot of German intellectuals, Thomas Mann included, who saw themselves as representing nationhood, a Europe of nations, a culturally and historically particular Europe, a Europe that was in turn internally pluralized against the fake universalism, overly expansionist universalism of the West. And this German revolt against what was originally Napoleonic universalism and the universalism of the French Revolution, and later became the universalism of the liberal Anglosphere. This revolt was globally influential. So in the beginning of the 20th century, the Germans lost the First World War, right? But their romantic counter to the West inspired emancipatory thinkers throughout the Third World, throughout the colonized world and the decolonizing world, So in China, figures like Liang Qichao and his generation were very much influenced by German Romanticism. Now, and the particularism and the historicism in German Romanticism. And now it's important to understand that being a romantic doesn't mean that you're not worldly or you're not realistic or you're living in a dreamland. It also doesn't mean that you don't believe in science and reason. The Romantics were kind of an add-on to the Enlightenment. So instead of being anti-Enlightenment, the Romantics were taking it a step further, where they added a historical self-awareness that was not in the original Enlightenment thought. So for example, Kant is still very much an Enlightenment thinker because he doesn't see it as a problem that he's thinking from within a particular context, that he's within a particular historical epoch, that he is in a particular culture, that he writes in a particular language. He doesn't see that as an epistemic problem for his philosophical claim. So he believes that he can reach universal truth, and he doesn't have to. Kant doesn't have to reflect on his cultural and historical particularity. But with Hegel, so we really they have overlapping lifespans, right? They're very close together in the timeline. With Hegel, already the particularity of the nation, culture, and self is an epistemic problem in philosophy. And then Hegel is already very much entering, the Romantic era of historicist self-reflection. For Hegel, this becomes an issue, right? And then Hegel argues that in order to reach the true universal, you should step out of a universalizing mode where you impose yourself upon the other, and you instead become historically aware of the self, that you are in a particular cultural and historical context. And that this is exactly something you share with all others in the world, because everyone is placed in a particular historical and cultural context. So the universal condition is being a historical and cultural particular. And through that realization, you reach, according to Hegel, the true universal. So that's a very rough account of Hegel. And of course, there's a lot going on in Hegel, but that's one way of understanding in particular Hegel's final closing arguments in the philosophy of right. So if you look at that Hegelian move where they say, actually, you're not giving up on the universal, but through self-recognizing your particularity, you reach the true universality. If you look at that Hegelian spirit, and then you look at contemporary China, right, and its notion of Chinese-style modernization and human rights theory with Chinese characteristics, Chinese-style human rights, you'll see that this is really very much in the same line of thought, because you have the same kind of reasoning here. You self-recognize your particularity. You recognize that you're a Chinese scholar with Chinese sources, and you're not just coming from nowhere. You're coming from a particular history, from a particular culture. But exactly because you have that self-awareness, can you have access to the actual universal condition, which is that everyone approaches a topic like human rights from a particular cultural and historical background. So that would be my sort of grand and sweeping account. I hope it wasn't too grand and too sweeping. But I think if you go back to the original dialectic in the early 19th century in Europe, it really is very eye-opening to what's happening right now on a global stage, where both in European politics but also in world politics, there are particularizing counters to the tendencies of Western civilization to self-universalize. So when the Chinese thinkers today in 2026 are uncomfortable with Western self-universalization, they are joining a tradition that actually goes back in European political thought to the early 19th century. And the thing that China reacts against in the present is very much the same core Enlightenment's Western self-universalization that the original Romantics in Europe responded against. So that would be my claim. Thank you very much. Oh, and I have a lot of questions for you because I want to know more about the exact relationship between the common values for humanity and um, the notion of self-recognized historical particularity in Chinese political thought. So that's one of the main topics I'm interested in, because I think it's a key concept in contemporary Chinese political thought. Linking these two is the community of common destiny, Renlei Mingyun Gongtongti, and I would love to hear some of your thoughts on how the interaction between the particular and the universal plays out in these contemporary Chinese conceptualizations. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks very much, Eric, for that whistle-stop tour of particularism and universalism in mainly in European thought, with some with a side order of reflections on Chinese thinking as well. So thank you very much, and I like the way you almost turned the tables at the end by saying, "I have questions for you." But first of all, we have questions for you, or we can have a discussion and dialogue. So, yeah, at this stage in the proceedings, I will throw the discussion open to our audience. I'm just trying to, so please feel free to come in with any questions or observations, or, yeah.
I hope people are not shy, not haisho.
Well, you've obviously answered all the possible
Maybe.
questions people might have. Is that Yuan? No, who did? Shenfei, sorry, did you want to? Yes, Shenfei, yes, come in.
Sorry. Okay, so maybe I have a very little question, because it's like your inspiring speech actually triggered a lot of things like in my mind. Because I previously had an internship in the regional office for Europe, like in Brussels, in the human rights office. So I do find that because I was working on the documents. It's called European Rule of Law report. We have to contribute to that report. I actually found that some of the categories is actually not fit into the European system. Like the European rule of law is actually not equals to the rule of law like within the UN system. So they have some differences, and that actually gave me some of the impression that the European values somehow it does not like actually four of them are not coming to the universal kind of level. And also I have read an article which I quote. It's a reflection from the International Law Commission report on the European on the human rights values, which is said that the human rights framework and free trade arrangement have consistently originated within the regional settings, despite the universalist claims of ideas about human rights or commodity markets. So they do. I just discovered like maybe they have created within the regional settings, but they do claim that they are universal somehow. But now I actually find the opposite is that from the UN level they have more like universal claims pumping out with like more countries supporting them. So as you also mentioned, like for like within the universal condition, would we have a more idea? Like I just wondering, like, what do you think? Do you think it's possible to have a universal condition be created in a universal settings, like in the UN, and with more powerful effect? And it's not only based on it's like go beyond for the any like of the country's views. It's just like with the foundation from the regional settings, but with a more step forward, like in the institutional work, like within, for example, the UN. What do you think? Like, is that possible? And how do you think, if so, like, how do you think it happened?
Yeah, so thanks for that, Shenfei. So if I understand your question correctly, you are wondering if it's possible. So you address various issues, but I think your main question is you're wondering whether it's possible to use the United Nations as a platform to reach a more truly universal sense of human rights, as opposed to from a European context. Is that what you're asking?
Yes.
Okay. Well, I mean, the United Nations uses the. So you guys are much more knowledgeable on this topic than I am, but I think the central document is still the 1948 Declaration of Human Rights, signed in Versailles, and there they try to solve it somewhat by having, among others, a Chinese representative, a representative of the Republic of China, bringing in a more Confucian perspective. But the question is whether that really solves the issue of universalism versus particularism, because just adding, in the overall approach to human rights is still very much coming from a particular history, namely Western history. These are very much rooted in Western conceptions. There's a very Kantian touch. It's very French influenced, and just adding a few things on top. I'm not sure if it's having someone from in the commission, a representative of the Republic of China. I'm not sure if that really gets us out of the philosophical problem, because you still have this. You still end up with a document that reflects a very much a particular product coming from a particular time period, with rooted in particular interpretive traditions that makes universal claims for all of humanity for all of time. So I think the philosophical problem is not evaded on the United Nations level. And then on the European level, even though, of course, in these, you mentioned the European Rule of Law report. And of course, the European Commission is filled with intelligent people who are educated. So they know, of course, that the concepts that they're using, the values that they're posing, liberty, freedom, rule of law, all have particular histories. They're not coming from nowhere. They're coming from particular traditions, coming out of a particular world region. So they are aware of that. The question is, however, to what extent that undermines the claim to universalism, to universal validity. It may not. However, it does need to be addressed how you go from something with a particular history, how you can come out of a particular interpretive tradition and be able to speak about things that are of universal validity. So that needs to be reflected upon, and the particularity of the self and its relation to universalism has to be reflected upon. And of course, such reflections are happening. They are at the centerpiece of European political thought, as they are at the centerpiece of Chinese contemporary political thought, and have been in China central to intellectual life since the generation of Liang Qichao. Since before that, also in China, you had a notion of you are the Chongguo, you are the central part of the world, right? It wasn't the Chongguo or the Chonghua. It wasn't an issue. You could just claim the center, and it was unproblematic. The center of all of humanity was your polity. But then with Liang Qichao's generation, such claims become problematic because suddenly there's a deeper historical and cultural self-awareness. The Chinese nation is something particular for Liang Qichao. And then the question is, how can you then have access to the universal? and the category of the universal. So this discussion has been part of Chinese intellectual life since the early 20th century and has been part of European intellectual life since the early 19th century. It's just that I think when the European Commission speak in its political discourses, when it poses European values, I don't think it has a lot of self-reflection going into those political discourses. I think there's still a tendency in the West, among certain groups of policymakers, politicians, and intellectuals and scholars, to just automatically claim a kind of Western avant-garde status where the West just supposedly happens to be ahead in discovering the true universal categories, even though its concepts are rooted in particular languages and particular interpretive traditions with particular histories. So I do think that we still, in European political thought and in how the European Commission approaches human rights and the notion of European values, I think we're still very much in the original problematic. I don't think this deep self-reflective historical self-awareness has truly shapes the mainstream political discourses on, for example, human rights coming from the European Commission at this point. But if you know, of course the European Commission has 100,000 people, so they are Europeans and being shaped by European intellectual life. They may have all kinds of individuals may have other inclinations, but I feel that in the European Commission right now, the mainstream is still very much enlightenment and self-universalizing. But I love to hear your impressions. You know, you worked in the regional office. Was it in Brussels where you worked, Shenfei?
Yeah, it's in Brussels, and it's just how to say? I would say the office is like keeping an eye on the policies and laws, like in from the Europe countries, and to see that if they align with the international human rights law or not.
Yeah. So, for example, a concrete example is the European Commission has said that a certain LGBTQI+ rights, such as transgender care for young people, is a human right that should be respected by all EU member states. But a lot of policymakers and intellectuals in the Visegrad countries, for instance, Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary, are saying, wait a second, I don't think transgender care for young people is a human right, because in fact we are opposed to these supposedly sex-changing operations being performed on minors, for example. And now you have a policy. So now you have one side saying we have a policy disagreement. Such operations should not be available to minors. And then you have the other side saying such operations in principle being available to minors is a human right. So there's then a dispute over whether such a thing is a human right. And you see human rights being weaponized in inter-European politics. And I think Chinese observers will not be surprised that European human rights are weaponized within European politics, because human rights have very much been weaponized in various ways over the last few decades in international politics. So this is a familiar story. So so that's definitely a huge issue right now in Europe.
Thank you.
I would have a question.
Yes.
Well, first of all, thank you very much. I found your talk very enlightening, to use a word that you used a lot. And I have preoccupied myself with the issue of universalism and particularism years ago. I've not pursued it though anymore. But I found it very enlightening what you pointed out, this historical development between Enlightenment thought and Romanticism, and also the role of Hegel in that regard. So that is very, very meaningful. And I would like to look up also this book that you mentioned, which is called The West. I have though not really understood the name of the author. Maybe you can tell me that later.
Varoufakis.
Varoufakis. Oh yeah, Varoufakis. All right. I would just like to add maybe one thought about this historical dimension. I mean, there's this philosophical side to it, but there's also this kind of realpolitik side to it. I mean, in the 19th century, the Western countries, the European countries, beginning with Spain and Portugal, and later on with England and with Holland and France, they conquered the whole world. And for that reason, it was self-understood that European thought is kind of conquering the whole world. And on top of it, there's also a kind of a continuation of a religious trait. I mean, after all, Europe is shaped by the Christian religion, and we have in Christian religion we have the claim of a universality. Still has it, you know, that the Christian religion is the only right religion, and so the human rights kind of politics in a way took over this tendency. So to with a kind of a missionary spirit to the human rights replaced in a way what we had before was religion. So this is only just kind of a thought that adding to what you had to say. On the other hand, since you mentioned that book of Varoufakis, I read the book last year by Pankaj Mishra. Maybe you've heard the guy's name. He's an Indian who lives in England now, and he wrote, to my view, a great book which is titled "From the Ruins of the Empire." From the Ruins of the Empire, and he covers in that book a whole range of thinkers in the so-called third world that was not the West, that were reacting against the West. And the West was at that time the British Empire that ruled the waves, you know, ruled the world. And he particularly deals in the Chinese context with Liang Qichao. Since you mentioned him, I would just like to mention that too. I find that book very much worth reading. Pankaj Mishra, From the Ruins of the Empire.
Thanks so much for those observations and insights there. First on the realpolitik side, you're absolutely right. So the way human rights is sometimes these days weaponized in opportunistic ways to further Western power. For example, when it comes to American foreign policy towards the Middle East, has a long tradition, a long colonial tradition, because of course, when the Spaniards arrived in the Americas in the 16th century, and they very much used the concept of law, which was a Roman tradition, to legitimize their rule. So they were bringing the law. So on the ground, people were dying en masse, dying of illness, dying of war, dying because they were put into work in mines, Spanish mines. So the situation is rather dramatic. But on paper, according to the Spaniards, it's about there's the law is being spread. So people are drawn into civilization, a universal civilization. Now, to the credit of the Spaniards, there was already a self-critical tradition emerging in the late 16th century, where Spanish intellectuals started saying, wait, we are being very opportunistic here with how we apply the law, to put it mildly. So that's the realpolitik dimension. Then on the universalisms in Western political thought building on top of each other. You mentioned that the human rights builds on a certain Christian universalism, which is also tied up with in later history with a Roman universalism, the Roman legal universalism, which in turn may be connected to a Greek philosophical universalism. So the main, I think, a very important author on this front is François Julian. He's a French philosopher. You're nodding, so you may know this person. Yeah, so he wrote a book, I think a decade and a half ago, maybe 2 decades ago, titled L'Universal, the Universal, on the Universal, in which he looks at the genealogy of Western universalisms. So there's a very long tradition of Western universalisms, which are all influencing each other and building on top of each other. Because, of course, Christianity had a universal claim. It saw itself as the universal religion for all humans on earth. The Romans had a universal claim with their law. Their law was bringing civilization to all humans on earth, and humans that were not under Roman law happened to be falling outside of the true civilization. So the validity of Roman law was everywhere where it was applied, but also everywhere where it was not applied but should be applied. What is happening then in European history is that with the early 19th century, there is a very strong and robust philosophical and historicist counter. And this counter is so powerful. It's channeled through figures such as Hegel, Herder, Humboldt. It actually establishes the modern humanities, the Geisteswissenschaften, which were leading. So the German humanities were leading in the 19th century. They actually emerged from a particularistic counter to these Western universalisms. Now, so there's always been Western universalisms, the competing versions competing with each other, trying to dethrone each other and borrowing ideas from each other. But this is the first time when there's really a powerful intellectual counter to universalism as such, where they say yes to universal, but not universalism. We shouldn't turn it into an ism. We should be historically self-aware, which is something early 19th century new. That brings us to Pankaj Mishra. I'm not sure if I read From the Ruins of the Empire, but I've read some works by Pankaj Mishra, and I read some of the works which I think he draws on. Namely, he is very much concerned with the pan movements of the early 19th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, because these pan movements are all very much romantic. So what are they? Pan-Slavism, Pan-Germanism. I should say it in proper order. Pan-Germanism, the true original. Pan-Slavism, Eurasianism, Pan-Islamism, Pan-Africanism, Pan-Asianism. All of these are growing out of the German Romanticism, and that's why I sometimes say that the Germans lost the First World War on the battlefield, but in many ways they won the intellectual battle, because the animating spirit of Thomas Mann, who systematized this German polemical vision from the First World War, that Germany was standing up to fight for Kultur, for culture, against, and particularity and history and nation, against the false universalism of the West. That dichotomy globalized, and it shaped, for example, Pan-Asianism. And Pan-Asianism is a very powerful, important movement in world history, and very much influential to today, even though the term has gone out of fashion. The central conceptual distinction of Pan-Asianism is there's a harmonious East that's aware of its particularity and wants to let all historical, cultural, national particulars in the world flourish according to their own characteristics, versus a bulldozing Western false universalism. And this dichotomy was, for example, promulgated in the famous 1924 speech by Chiang Kai-shek, the founder of modern China, in his famous Kobe speech for the Pan-Asianists in Japan, where he warned the Japanese Pan-Asianists, saying, I'm on your side. I also stand for a harmonious East against a hegemonic West. But please don't abuse this idea for Japanese power. And of course, later history tragically showed that the Japanese did exactly that. But then since that time, both in Japan and in China, this notion of a harmonious East versus a hegemonic West has been central. And you still see this in contemporary Chinese political discourses on, for example, human rights. You see this dichotomy, which is an actual Pan-Asian dichotomy. But this Pan-Asianism is actually draws inspiration from, is powerfully influenced by the original anti-Westernism, or the original critique of Western universalism, which was German and Romantic, and to a lesser extent Austrian and British, because there were parallel movements also with Burke, very much a romantic conservative from Britain, and then you had the romantics in Germany. But you had the romantics and the conservatives in both Britain and Germany, and they were in parallel responding, and in Austria, and they were in parallel responding to the universalism of the French Revolution. And that later radicalized that romanticism. It radicalized to an anti-Westernism, or a critique of Westernism, to say it more positively. And that critique of Westernism from around 1900 and the first decades of the 20th century globalized, and as such became a very powerful legacy that people such as Pankaj Misha, they analyze this, because this is the pan movements, which are drawing from the romantic spirit, were vital in the decolonizing movements throughout the world, and they're still vital in how the claim to particularity on behalf of all these non-Western states is expressed in the present.
Okay, I'm good. Thanks, Eric. You have your hand up.
Oh yeah. So thank you very much, Eric. Thanks for your presentation, and I would like to give a very short response to your question, if I understand correctly, remember correctly, because that's like, after your very lengthy response to the previous two questions. So you are asking the major differences between the Chinese values and the European values, right?
What I'm particularly interested in is in a conceptual relationship between the common values of humanity and the notion of a Chinese path of development and human rights. Because the notion of a Chinese path is particularizing, and the common values of humanity could be seen as a universalistic claim, but it's not really, because I feel it is connected, it is supposed to hover above all the nations and cultures as a kind of universal truth. But I think it is the spirit, the necessary spirit of the concrete existence of the community of common destiny, Renlei Mingyun Gongtong Ti, manifesting. So I think that's the key, the triangle somehow.
Okay. So I would like to explain a little bit, but because you are contextualizing your presentation on the European unions and then the Chinese values, I would like to respond in 3 points. Okay, the first one is that the Chinese values. Now, you have already mentioned that the Chinese values, they are trying to promoting like the common, the shared value or the shared future of the humanity or the mankind. So this is the values that the China is now proposing. Okay, so in terms of these kind of the values, also very related with the Chinese path of the development and also the existence. So the China now, they put much emphasis on these kind of two basic human rights. The first is the philosophical foundation, which kind of like differs from the European philosophical basis you just have mentioned. The China put is like the it derives is this kind of like proposition from the philosophies that it emphasizes the humanity, or in a more broad sense, there is the collectivism, which differs from the European values based on atomic individualism. So they put it very simply. And so you may have noticed that like the intellectuals like Liang Qichao, you mentioned that quite a lot. They really, mention a lot these kind of like notions, such as such as the world is for all, and also the Chinese values, they emphasize the community, and also the humankind, or the mankind. So these kind of very big words, actually, they are the philosophical basis or the philosophical foundation is collectivism, or so this is the first difference. The second difference is that the Chinese values, actually, they emphasize quite a lot about the the practical approach to human rights, to particularly like the realization of the human rights, or we could also say that it is kind of like enforcement of the human rights. So that's why the Chinese government, they put priority on the right to existence and also the right to development, which differs a little bit from the European values, which prioritize like the democracy and the liberty. So those are the difference, and of course the other one, the third one is that you also mentioned that previously the European values, they adopted exclusive legitimate approach to human rights, but China now, by comparison, it is adopts a like inclusive approach to human rights. But okay, so this is a very rough and quick response, but this is very complicated and question. We could discuss it further. Due to the time limits, okay, I would not go further, go into the details. But I do have a question for you. So, do I have the time for the question, Zhou?
Go ahead, you want.
Oh yeah. So my question is that, okay, so you also mentioned that now China has now they adopt or interpret the Western ideas of rights. This kind of like adoption and the interpretation of a Western idea of rights, it can be seen of China's effort to reconstruct universalism through a particular lens, right? So since you I think many Western scholars, they have aware of that. So I would like to ask, according to your observation, has this kind of the Chinese practice impact the European Union's current the rhetoric strategy? If there is any impact, so what exactly are these impact?
Yeah, I wish it would have an impact, but I'm looking for it. I'm studying it. I because I think a lot in the European Union would immediately be better. In terms, if we would just, for example, say we wouldn't say European values are universal values. European values includes human rights, but instead would say something along the lines of European style human rights theory, because just doing something very simple like that, right? What China always does, they say Chinese style, Chinese approach to with Chinese characteristics, 中国特色. So it's a very simple add-on, but it immediately creates an entirely different mind space, because it implies that, as you say, there's various legitimate approaches. You have an inclusive approach. Your approach acknowledges immediately at the get-go that there are other legitimate approaches, and that is just so important in the contemporary political situation. And I don't really see the European Union doing this. I'm going around telling people that we need to start adding with European characteristics to things, because it will remind us that there are other approaches and that we are something particular, and that from the particular we're reaching out to the universal, and we're not coming out of nowhere. So so I want to learn. I want you to learn from China in that regard. So the way you outlined it, right? Thanks for the outline, right? So you mentioned the 3 points. So first, the Chinese approach to human rights compared to European approach to human rights is more focused on the material foundation, because you need a material foundation before you can add like political and civil rights. And then second, on a philosophical level, it is more it is more. It has a more inclusive approach where it immediately acknowledges the legitimacy of other approaches. And
yeah, it derives from like the collectivism, or we could say like the community, or yeah. So this is a kind of like in the very broad sense. This is more much more complicated in terms of the philosophical lens.
Yeah.
But we could say describe it as collectivism, comparing to individualism in the Western values.
Yeah, and then the important thing is that with this collectivism comes the notion of harmonized differences. So the idea is not that there are no differences, not uniformity. That's this famous phrase. So you are in harmony, playing as a symphony orchestra, but each instrument is different. So now one of the markers of these philosophical differences, these differences in philosophical aspiration between Chinese style human rights theory and the predominant Western style of human rights theory, is that is in a magazine such as the Human Rights Journal. So this is Human Rights Journal, which you also engage with in China. And if you read their papers, one of in the English translations, a very striking thing is that they never use the term universalism to describe the approach of the Chinese human rights theory. They use the word common and shared. So it's the common values or shared values of mankind. It's not the universal values of mankind. And they use in the English translation, but also in the Chinese, they use the universalism to describe the Western style universalism. And through this, they try to flag that there is a different approach to the universal in Chinese political thought. So that's very interesting. And a thinker that in contemporary China that I think has a lot of insight on this is Jin Huimin of Sichuan Daxue. So he leads the humanities department of Sichuan Daxue. He's the Jin Huimin, and he writes about the different approaches to universalism and the different ways you can approach the universal. So you can approach universalism by trying to override the other with the self, which is exactly the type of universalism that Hegel already criticized. And Hegel called it the Roman spirit, because the Romans, they want to conquer you and then put you under the law. And it's the same with Napoleon. Like, he conquers you and then he brings you freedom, supposedly, but he also conquers you. So it's a hegemonic universalism. And it's interesting that a lot of Chinese scholars, such as also Changsha, use the term Roman spirit. What's happening?
Some interference there coming in.
So there's sorry, I'm just saying that just to end up like Zhang Shigong also has this notion of the Roman spirit being underlying this hegemonic sense of Westernism. So I think I think that's very interesting. And of course, the other type of the more enlightened version, or the better version, the more romantic version, I should say, of being universalistic or approaching universal, is through self-recognized particularity. So that for Hegel that would be the end of history in the Hegel's philosophy. But that's the ultimate stage. And I think the romantic notion of self-aware, historically self-aware approach is actually a more advanced approach to universal. And I see that in Chinese style human rights theory, and I also see that in European historicist romantic approaches.
Eric, if I may be allowed, just, and I'm just conscious of the time, just like an aside, and maybe we'll have you back at some point to discuss further these some of the things we didn't explore as fully as we might have wanted to on this occasion. Just something that occurs to me, obviously, you talked about Kant, and obviously Kant had a big influence on Marx, and as did Hegel, and both of them shared, you might say, an evolutionary optimism, a certain view of kind of the inevitability, historicism, to use Karl Popper's term, that the inevitability of progress to, a particular destination, and of course then Marx transplanted to China. So there are several intellectual influences going on there, aren't there? Just another observation, really not a question to you, Eric, and I'm abusing my role as chair, is I come from, not from a legal position per se, but just as strongly from a social policy and social science perspective, and I'm interested in the role of political ideology and the role of different types of ideology to legitimate states and rule, and of course, often, and in modern times and in ancient times, you have different discourses of rule which claim a universal application, and these justify the continued regime, the continued hegemonic system, and often where you have a claim like that, the role of social science can be to say, well, here's what you're claiming about the world, but this is actually what's happening. So the gap between the way the world is supposed to work, the way the ideology is claiming the world works, and well, actually, it's not actually working out quite like that, is it? So that gap is something we didn't really explore today, I guess. But that's I think that's an interesting one to an interesting field of exploration and research for sure. So just asides, I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Sure. I mean, I feel that what you're saying here is that social science can play a critical function in being anti-imperial, breaking through imperialistic modes of thought. So a type of self-universalization in the political realm is, as you correctly point out, is intimately related to imperialism. Because with imperialism doesn't just come physical conquest, but it also comes a universalistic claim to to a legitimacy that covers the whole of the world and the whole of time. So a true empire in an imperialistic self-understanding will see itself as representing the world center and the whole of eternity. So, for instance, the Holy Roman Empire, even though it was rather small and it knew there were other large states surrounding it, saw itself as the carrier of the true Christianity, and Christianity as the true faith. And hence the Holy Roman Empire did see itself in its most militant imperialistic versions, saw itself as representing the world. It's the centering part that creates order to the world. Now, China, in its dynasties, had a similar notion. The Roman Empire had such a notion. So all empires have an elite. It's not everyone. It's not the common person necessarily, right, that believes this, but they have an elite that creates a sense of imperialistic legitimacy. And a critical thing that, of course, social science can do is break through such claims to the world. So, okay, you say you claim the world, but I have some information for you. The terminology you're using is actually rather recent and has a very particular history. Oh, that's interesting. Oh, and there are actually other interpretations coming from other parts of the world. Oh, and you know that there are actually other types of intellectuals, even in your imperial center, that think differently about this. Oh, right. So that's how. Oh, and you know that when your supposed freedom campaign or your hit the ground, it didn't go so well. So, for example, during the times of the Japanese Empire, you had these Pan-Asian imperialists who believed that Japan was liberating Asia, and through the liberalization of Asia, it would harmonize the world. And so Japan would be the teacher of the East Asian peoples, Southeast Asian peoples. And then as such, it would be the teacher of the world, bringing everyone under Hakuitsyo, the 8 corners under one roof. So there was an imperialistic ideology that emerged in Imperial Japan very quickly in the early 40s. But then in 41, when larger strips of territory were conquered, but already before that in Manchukuo, in Manchuria, and with the invasion of the rest of China, there was a reality on the ground of military abuse, of human rights abuse, right? Horrific human rights abuse. And a lot of it in Japan, there were the type of intellectuals that kind of shielded themselves from the information that was coming out of the conquered territories. This is not Hakuitzio. This is actually brutal military dictatorship. But there were also some who actually listened and said, ho, we were supposed to bring Hakuitzio, but they're killing Chinese people. They're doing horrible things. This is not the true spirit of Hakuitzio. So yes, so certainly deconstructing such world claims is absolutely vital, and it's probably the most important way social science can be critical in contemporary society.
And I'm going to leave you. Thank you, Eric. Again, I'm going to leave you with the last word there. I want to thank all our audience. I want to thank everybody who asked very interesting questions. Thanks to Changsha Law School and the Human Rights Centre there for hosting this session of the Human Rights Universal Global Open Talk. And we hope to have another talk on the last Friday of July 2026. And I'm sure you'll all join me in thanking our presenter today, Eric Hendriks. Eric, I was calling you Eric Roberts at one point earlier. You politely overlooked that. Eric Hendriks from Wiesbaden and other New York and elsewhere, a dizzying array of places. So thanks again, and we hope to have you back at some stage indeed. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much.
Goodbye. Thank you.